Good morning, Miss Rigg.
Good morning.
Would you raise your hand and say the words of the oath after me? I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that I will tell the truth,
that I will tell the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Miss Thompson.
Good morning.
Good morning.
You're Marcia Rigg,
I am.
and you were born in 1964.
Yes.
You were the sister of Sean Rigg, who died in police custody after being restrained on the 21st of August in 2008.
Yes.
Ms. Rigg, can I ask you to open up the blue folder that's in front of you? There are a number of documents in there, and I'm hoping that the first in the bundle will be a statement that you gave to the inquiry. It has the reference number SBPI 00630. We'll bring it up on the screen in front of you, but some people prefer a hard copy, and so it's in the folder if you prefer to work with paper. So this is your statement, and if we scroll down, we'll see that you gave your statement on the 21st and 22nd of May of this year. And if we go to the very bottom of your statement, I think it's 60 or 61 pages long. At the very bottom, we will see that you signed your statement on the 14th of June. Now, on the screen, your signature has been blacked out, but I'm hoping that your signature will appear in the hard copy that's in front of you.
Yes.
If we can look at the very last paragraph in your statement, it reads, I believe the facts stated in this witness statement are true. I understand that this statement may form part of the evidence before the inquiry and be published on the inquiry's on the inquiry's website. And so when you gave your statement, when you signed your statement, you did so knowing that it would become part of the evidence before the inquiry.
Yes.
And did you do your best to give truthful and accurate responses to the questions that you were asked?
Yes, I did.
Also in the folder, and we don't need these on screen just now, but let's just check that you've got hard copies in front of you, there should be 3 reports. There should be a copy of the IPCC's report and a copy of the verdict of the inquest jury and a copy of the Casale report.
Yes.
At various points during your evidence, I will take you to paragraphs within those reports. They'll come up on the screen in front of us, but again, they're there in hard copy in case you prefer to work with hard copy. You can dip into any of these documents at any time if you would find that helpful when you're giving your evidence, and if there's anything that you would like to be shown on the screen, then please just let me know.
Thank you.
Before I ask you any questions, Ms. Rigg, I understand that you sought permission from the chair to address the families of Shekubayo, and that permission has been granted. So you're welcome to speak to the families now.
Thank you. I sit here in solidarity with you and other families. I appreciate and respect your tenacity and your hard work to bring this inquiry to the forefront of this injustice. I respect you, I love you, and I send my condolences to the family. More power to you, and never give up. Thank you for having me here to speak at this very important inquiry. Thank you. Thank you.
I wondered, Ms. Rigg, if you might like to tell us a little bit about your brother Sean, the person he was and what he meant to you.
Yes, Sean was my brother. He was in the middle of the family, second brother, and he was charming, he was handsome, he was loved by many. And sadly, he suffered with mental health the last 20 years of his life, but that didn't stop him from doing the work that he did. He was a musician, he was well-traveled, and you know, he was a nice guy. He was my brother, and I miss him.
Thank you. Ms. Rigg, to give some context to your evidence and for the benefit of any members of the public who might be watching today who won't as yet have seen your statement, it will be published on our website later today. I would like to take you to paragraphs 2, 3, and 4 of your statement, which summarise the events of the evening that you lost your brother. And I wondered whether you might like to read those paragraphs rather than me.
Yes, please. Paragraphs 2, 3, and 4?
2, 3, and 4.
Yeah. My brother, Sean Rigg, died in police custody on the 21st of August 2008 following a mental health crisis. I will first summarize about what happened to my brother on the night he died, to give some context to the reader. Sean suffered with mental health issues for 20 years, but lived an independent life when well, a talented musician, healthy and likable man. He was just 40 years old. He was not a criminal and did not take drugs. I was his primary carer as his eldest sibling. Sean was living in assisted accommodation, a hostel in Brixton, South London, at the time of his death. On the 21st of August, the staff there were extremely concerned about his psychotic behavior and deteriorating mental health. He had relapsed because he was overdue his medication by 2 months. Staff made several desperate 999 calls over a period of about 3 hours to the police, asking for them to attend the hostel to take Sean to a place of safety, a hospital, as he was vulnerable and extremely unwell. His name and mental health condition was given to the call handler, and the police CAD record was opened. Police refused to attend, saying it was not a police matter. Sean eventually left the hostel at about 7:05 p.m. and went out into the streets actively psychotic. It was blatantly obvious that he needed urgent medical assistance and care. Members of the public saw that he was unwell and called the police too. He was dressed inappropriately, naked from the waist up, erratic, doing martial art kicks towards the public and walking in and out of traffic. These were clear indications of a mental health crisis. Sean was subsequently detained and handcuffed to the rear by 4 Metropolitan Police officers at about 7:40 p.m. for a public order offence, alleged assault on a police officer, and theft of his own cancelled passport, claiming that he did not think the photo looked like the man detained. No checks were made for the passport by any of the officers. The handcuffing took about 30 seconds. He was searched and restrained face down throughout in the prone position, using unsuitable and unnecessary force for 7 to 8 minutes, whilst one officer pinned down his legs and the other at the top of his shoulders near his neck. A witness took 2 photos of the restraint on her mobile phone while looking out of her window. Multiple witnesses say Sean was struggling but was not resisting. He was eventually brought to his feet and assisted to the back of a perspex caged police van, where the officers say that from the seat he slipped down into the footwell of the cramped cage, still restrained with handcuffs to the rear, and was allegedly on his back or bottom, spinning 360 degrees whilst walking his feet around the caged walls. This action sounds implausible. He was then driven at speed on Blues and Twos to Brixton Police Station not a nearby hospital. They arrived at the station at 7:53 p.m. Sean was kept in the van due to the arresting officer's claim that Sean was violent and had kicked off inside the van. The custody suite was subsequently cleared at the request of the sergeant, who said that the custody suite was busy and that a violent man was coming in. The sergeant also claimed that he went outside to the van and looked at Sean directly into his eyes, and Sean was just staring, that he was sitting up on the seat with his head leaned on the left side, on the left shoulder. He shouted at Sean, but he did not respond, and that he had no concerns with Sean's health. CCTV proved that this was not true, and his account was a complete fantasy. After about 11 minutes, Sean was removed from the van in a collapsed state, heavily assisted by 2 officers under each shoulder, with a very short walking distance, a few steps, to a caged holding cell outside in the yard at the entrance to the custody suite at about 8:03 p.m. It can be seen on CCTV footage from inside Brixton Police Station that, on entering the cage, Sean immediately collapsed to the ground. Officers claim that he wanted to sleep, which means that his eyes were shut, and that he never spoke once throughout. One officer said he thought Sean was mute. Sean is sat up with his back propped against the wall of the cage, clearly collapsed, including his legs and his head, with officers propping his legs up with their feet, claiming that he was in the way of people coming through the cage to enter the custody suite. Excuse me. He collapsed over again onto his right side at 8:06 p.m. and is put into the prone position, still cuffed. There were multiple officers inside the cramped cage throughout, about 5 or 6, including the arresting officers who were periodically in and out of the cage into the custody suite, speaking to the sergeant and others. No doctor was called to attend to Sean at this time, although there was a forensic medical examiner, an FME, on duty. The sergeant in charge checks on Sean for the first time, who was now being put in the recovery position. The sergeant can be heard saying at various times that Sean was faking fitting and unconsciousness, that custody should be cleared as a violent man was coming in, and if he dies in here, we're all in the shit. At about 8:11 p.m., Sean was stood up and held by 2 officers, which was completely inappropriate. The officers claim that Sean just suddenly stood up by himself. After a minute or so, the officers let go and Sean collapsed again to the floor and was assisted and put into the recovery position. Only one hand of the cuffs was released, but they were not totally removed. The FME is only now called and attends at 8:13 p.m. and says that Sean is having a heart attack, should be covered with a blanket, and to call an ambulance. Sean is now partially obscured from the inside cameras and only his legs can be seen. One of the arresting officers, the one that was at Sean's neck whilst being restrained, can be heard telling the sergeant that he had Sean's blood on him, and I hope he, meaning Sean, ain't got nothing. He also said, "Oh Christ, he's faking it." The truth is that Sean was fatally unwell and died shortly afterwards on the cold ground practically naked, wearing only Speedos. His trousers had been cut off at the feet of multiple police officers who claimed that they had been monitoring him. Sean never ever enters the custody suite and was dead within an hour of being arrested, no later than 8:24 p.m., when officers shout for defib as they suddenly realized that Sean was not breathing. Officers commenced CPR at about 8:26 p.m. The defibrillator machine can be heard advising no shock since there was no heart rhythm. No emergency 999 called was made until 8:33 p.m. when an inspector in the building telephoned down to custody telling them to call 999 directly. Paramedics arrived at 8:36 p.m. Sean was acetoled and CPR was continued by the paramedics and taken to King's College Hospital at 9:04 p.m. He was pronounced dead at 9:24 p.m.
Thank you.
Thank you.
How tall was Sean?
Not exceptionally tall. I don't recall exactly, but he was. I'm 5'7". He was about 5'8", 5'9", around the same height, I think. Not exceptionally tall.
Do you know what his weight was?
No, but he wasn't a large man. He was fit and healthy, well-toned. He was health conscious about what he ate. He didn't smoke. He didn't take drugs. He didn't take alcohol. And, you know, he was a musician, and so he was concerned about the way that he looked, and so he took care of his body, of his health.
Ms. Rigg, there were a number of investigations into Sean's death and the events that followed his death over a period of years. And again, to give some context to your evidence, what I would like to do is take you through 3 of those reports. And I'm looking to draw out perhaps similarities between Sean's experience and Shekobayo's experience. Let's begin with the IPCC report. It's in your folder. We'll bring it up on the screen. It's reference SVPI 00488. So we see from the first page that this is a report by the IPCC, the Independent Police Complaints Commission. IPCC independent investigation into the death of Sean Rigg whilst in the custody of Brixton Police, and complaints made by Mr. Wayne Rigg and Ms. Angela Wood.
Wayne Rigg is my brother.
He's your brother, thank you. And Angela Wood?
She was she was at the Fairmount Hostel. She was the lady that was making some of the 999 calls. So she was the manager at the hostel where Sean lived.
I see. So this report was intended to investigate the circumstances of the death, and as part of that process, account was to be taken of complaints made by your family and by the hostel where Sean lived.
Yes.
The report is quite lengthy. It's 162 pages, I think. It's not dated, but my understanding is that it was shared with interested parties in February of 2010,
Correct.
although it wasn't published until 2 years later, August of 2012.
Yes, it was published on the 1st of August 2012, the day of the jury's narrative verdict at Sean's inquest. But the family, through disclosure, had received it back in 2010. But of course it wasn't published, and so we were aware of the contents but couldn't speak about it.
Thank you. So in a little while we will look at the narrative verdict given by the inquest jury, but in order to get a chronology in our minds, we should understand that the first investigation was the IPCC one, and the report was certainly finalised by February of 2010, albeit it wasn't published until the day that the inquest verdict was handed down.
Yes. Could I just say that when my family and I read the report, we were outraged, and we could have decided to judicial review the IPCC at that point. But we decided that we had waited 4 years to come this far. We didn't want any more delays, and that we knew that it was nonsense to the family's mind, that the content and its conclusions were the wrong ones. So we decided to go ahead with it and show them up at the inquest, which is what happened.
Let's take this in stages. Let's begin by looking at the content and the findings of this report,
Yes.
and then we'll turn to look at what happened at the inquest. Let's perhaps begin with page 7, which sets out the terms of reference. So the terms of reference were to investigate the circumstances surrounding the police contact with Sean Rigg on the 21st of August 2008 as follows. The circumstances leading to support worker telephoning the police, subsequent calls to the police, and then the arrest of Sean Rigg and his transportation to Brixton Police Station and then to the custody suite, his time in the custody holding cage up to him being taken to hospital by ambulance at 9:02 p.m, the cause of his death and whether or not any acts or omissions of any police officer caused or contributed to his death, to establish whether there were any systemic issues within the Metropolitan Police Service which caused or contributed to his death, to establish whether any acts or omissions of any police officer were motivated by the ethnicity of Sean Rigg, post-incident management and operation of CCTV systems. So those were the terms of reference. What I would like to do now is take you to key passages within the report that focus on themes that are perhaps of particular relevance to this inquiry. And they are mental health, the use of restraint, monitoring, and evidence of criminality and racial motive. So I wonder if we can turn to page 104.
Could I just say I've not looked at this report for many, many years.
Don't worry, I will take you to the passages that I wish to draw attention to, and they'll come up on the screen
Thank you.
too. So we see the heading in the report here. Officers did not recognise Mr. Rigg as a person with mental health needs, and that was one of the concerns that had been brought to the door of the IPCC, and which they were tasked with investigating. Paragraph 421 states that the above statement, according to the officers, is true. Therefore, the question needs to be asked, should they have recognised him as a person with mental health needs? And if we can jump down to paragraph 425. Even if the officers had been aware of Mr. Rigg's medical history, the arrest and restraint would not have been handled any differently. Mr. Rigg was a man acting in an aggressive and violent manner that attempted to evade arrest. He had assaulted a police officer and was restrained accordingly. So that was the view taken by the IPCC. And if we carry on to the next page, please, and we'll look at paragraph 427. Here, a concern is expressed that none of the 4 officers involved considered the possibility that there might have been an underlying cause for Sean's behaviour. And at paragraph 429, there's a summary of that behaviour. It states, the officers were aware that Mr. Rigg was walking the streets, semi-clothed, attacking people and performing martial arts moves. He evaded arrest, assaulted a police officer and resisted arrest. The officers witnessed his behaviour in the back of the van. Mr. Rigg had been occasionally growling and did not speak to anyone during the course of the whole incident. And if we carry on, despite all of the above indicators, none of the officers considered the possibility that Mr. Rigg may have been suffering from a mental illness. If this possibility had been identified, then according to the standard operating procedures, where an individual with a mental illness resists the restraint in a violent, prolonged manner, the physical stress on the person's body may result in death. Therefore, in all such cases, the police officers concerned must treat the situation as a medical emergency and obtain emergency medical care. The officers insist that they did not realise that Mr. Rigg was suffering from a mental illness, and there is no evidence to to suggest that their assertion is not true. And if we carry on, we'll see that that is the concluding paragraph under that particular heading within the report. So those were the findings, such as they were of the IPCC in relation to the officer's awareness or otherwise of Sean's mental ill health. I don't at this stage need to invite your comment on that. I'm simply keen to identify passages of this report which perhaps we will see stand in marked contrast to the findings of the inquest jury. So this is really to set the scene, and we see from passages that we've looked at what the IPCC had to say about mental ill health. Let's look at restraint now, please. Can we go to page 113? And you'll appreciate that this is a very lengthy report, and so I am reading it short. So this was a section of the report that looked at restraint and was considering the proposition that Mr. Rigg was not restrained in accordance with local and national procedures on restraint of persons with mental illness. So that was the banner. And the conclusion at paragraph 472 is this: the statement of Inspector Sutcliffe provides a comprehensive account of the training, thought processes and techniques used when attempting to secure a violent individual. This investigation has uncovered no evidence to suggest that the techniques used by the officers and the level of force applied during the arrest of Mr. Rigg was disproportionate or unlawful. So that was their conclusion. And I think I'm right in saying that the IPCC hadn't instructed an expert in use of force. Does that accord with your understanding?
So the first investigation, whether they instructed somebody, I don't recall.
That's all right.
I don't recall what they did. All those original investigators were ex-police officers. I recall that they sent, such as the CCTV, for the CCTV, to look at the CCTV and to make the compilation for the inquest was an ex-police officer, which we were concerned about. And all those investigators retired very early on into the investigation, well before the inquest. So after the first report, this report, they retired. So most of them.
Thank you. Moving on from restraint, let's look at the monitoring of Sean's health after the restraint had commenced. And if we can turn to page 113, please. Oh, I think we've just gone beyond 113. Sorry, 114, I beg your pardon. It's my fault. So the proposition that was being considered here is that the officers failed to monitor Mr. Rigg's medical condition and ensure that he received medical attention when it became apparent that he was ill. Once the officers realised that Mr. Rigg was in need of medical attention, they immediately called for the FME to assess him. This happened when they saw that Mr. Rigg had urinated, an obvious sign of some form of distress. Once the FME had assessed Mr. Rigg, the officers monitored his condition by watching his breathing. When his condition deteriorated, they again called for the FME's assistance. It can be seen from the CCTV footage that the officers were in continual close attendance, and their efforts at CPR can be clearly observed. So we don't here see any criticism or any suggestion of failings on the part of the officers in terms of their response to your brother's deteriorating condition.
According to this report, yes.
According to the report, yes.
Yeah.
I'm just at the moment looking at what we see on the page.
Yes.
But yes, according to this report, there don't appear to have been any failings identified in terms of how Sean was monitored after the restraint commenced and after his condition began to deteriorate.
Yes.
Can we move on to page 117, please? And at paragraph 499, and the proposition that's being considered is a little bit further up, but it's to the effect that the family believe the police officers are suspects in the murder or manslaughter of Mr. Rigg. So that was a concern.
Sorry, where are you reading from there?
Sorry, I was actually just for convenience
Right.
reading, but let's do this properly. Let's go to page 115, please. Very bottom, if we stop there. The way that the report is structured is the IPCC have underlined propositions, as it were, based, I think, on concerns raised by the family and the lady from the hostel. They then go on to consider each one. So the heading is here at the bottom of page 115, but the conclusion we will find at paragraph 499, which is on page 117.
Yes.
So that was the proposition that was under consideration. And the conclusion reached was that the investigation has uncovered no evidence to substantiate the family's allegation that the officers should be suspects in the manslaughter or murder of Mr. Rigg. So we see that was the conclusion reached by the IPCC. Let's look at the findings. We looked at the terms of reference at the beginning, and they covered a full page of the report. There were, however, only 2 findings. And if we look at the very bottom of page 141, finding 1, and that relates to the CCTV system, which was not in full working order.
Yes.
We can keep scrolling down, please. And finding 2, the officers adhered to policy and good practice by monitoring Mr. Rigg in the back of the van whilst being transported to Brixton Police Station following his arrest. So a positive finding is made that the officers adhered to policy and good practice by monitoring Sean in the van en route to the police station. And those were the only 2 findings that the IPCC made. And you may recall, we looked at the very beginning at the terms of reference and the bullet points beneath the terms of reference, one of which was to establish whether any acts or omissions of any police officer were motivated by the ethnicity of Sean Rigg. And no finding has been made in that regard at all. The issue appears not to have been addressed at all by the IPCC.
That's correct. Quite extraordinary, really.
Sorry, I didn't.
That's quite extraordinary, really, because it was part of the terms of reference, yet they did not address it, as you say. It's quite extraordinary.
And you say yourself in your statement, and we don't need it on the screen, but for reference, it's at paragraph 8, that you believe that Sean's race contributed to the way that he was treated by the arresting officers. But I understand that you didn't raise your concerns with the IPCC, and that you were concerned that there might be consequences if you were to do so. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Absolutely, yes. There was no doubt in my mind or the family's mind that because Sean was black and a man, that didn't cause concern, and the way that he would have been treated by police officers. So I categorically repeat now here today that his race must have caused, his race must have been in the minds of the officers at the time of his arrest. But as a family, a black family, we didn't want to be labelled with the term a chip on our shoulder, or that we were pulling the race card. Because that's, always the first thing that they say. Oh, you always say we're just being racist. So we decided not to use the race card, because Sean's a human, and race shouldn't have shouldn't have to be something that somebody has to look at, because everybody is a human being, and he should have been treated fairly, morally, and with care, and that didn't happen. So we deliberately decided not to use the so-called race card, because we just thought that was obvious. We didn't want to jeopardize the investigation. We didn't want to appear hostile. You know, we had a campaign, a media campaign. We never used the word race or racism. That was a deliberate decision by the family, which was unfortunate, but that's just the way it is.
Why do you say it was unfortunate?
It was unfortunate because, in hindsight, you know, they didn't look at the issue of race at all. When we expected them to do that, naturally, if somebody's, for example, if somebody is being looked for by the police on the street, one of the first things they describe them, IC3 or IC1, you know, male, black male, wearing whatever, you know, to identify who that person is. So why didn't they use any of that in the? It came up nowhere in the evidence whatsoever by the police officers about, you know, this man who was in their custody, who they did not recognise had mental health issues, or that he was black. Really? It's quite strange, but it was unfortunate or deliberate that the IPCC did not address the issue of race. I think that was deliberate.
Let's move on from the IPCC and talk now about the inquest. The verdict is a narrative verdict, and we have a copy here within the inquiry papers, and the reference is SBPI 00524. And we see here that the inquest was opened on the 28th of August, but adjourned until June of 2011.
Yes.
And I think the verdict, in fact, was given in the August. Is that right?
Yeah, the verdict was on the 1st of August 2012. I should say that between the 28th of August 2008, a week after Sean's death, that's when it was just, you know, the opening of the inquest to say his name, the date of his death, and where he lived. His death was not ascertained at the time. We didn't know how he died. But between that day and the end of the inquest 4 years later, there was numerous pre-inquest reviews and discussions regarding disclosure and how the inquest would take form during that time. So it just wasn't 28th of August 2008, and then the next time was the 11th of June 2012. There were numerous what we call pre-inquest hearings in between.
So there was work going on in the background.
Yes.
But the inquest having been opened on the 28th of August 2008, it was officially adjourned and resumed on the 11th of June 2012.
Yes.
The jury gave their verdict on the 1st of August of 2012, which was roughly 6 weeks later. Should we understand then that there were maybe 6 weeks or thereby of evidence?
I think it was set down for 8 weeks of evidence, and then in the end it was about 7 weeks. Unfortunately, some of the witnesses that were supposed to give evidence towards the end, you know, the coroner was kind of running out of time, and so some of them did not end up giving evidence. But yeah, all in all, I think it was about 7 weeks.
And we
roughly
see recorded Sean's full name and then the cause of death, which has been given by the jury as 1A, cardiac arrest, 1B, acute arrhythmia, 1C, ischemia, and 1D, partial positional asphyxia.
Yes.
We see further down the page that the jury appear to have made a correction to the place of death, and they have confirmed that the place of death was not King's College Hospital, but was Brixton Police Station.
Yes, could I just say about that, we found that very important because we knew from the very beginning that Sean died at Brixton Police Station, and the IPCC, or the evidence that that was being put forward, was that he died at the hospital, and so even the jury could see that he died at the police station. So we were very happy that they'd actually crossed that out and put they handwrote it themselves, Brixton Police Station. That was very important for myself and the family.
So that mattered to you, and we will come back to this when we complete going through the reports and turn to your own personal lived experience. But one of the issues I would like to talk to you about is the information that was put into the media, and I understand that the information that was put out there initially was that Sean had died in the hospital and not in the police station.
Yes.
And so as a family it was very important to you that the jury made that correction.
Yes.
The jury then delivered a narrative verdict. It's more than 2 pages long. I wonder if we can scroll down to the narrative verdict. And again, I'm going to pick out the aspects that are perhaps most relevant for our purposes. If we could go to the top of that page, please. On the 21st of August 2008, 2024 hours, Sean Nicholas Rigg died at Brixton Police Station as a result of a cardiac arrest. There is then some discussion that perhaps we don't need to look at in detail about his medication regime, about relapse in his mental health, about the care provided at the hostel and plans that were in place among stakeholders and so on. But if we can go to the very bottom of the page, which deals with the police response. The level of force used on Sean Rigg whilst he was restrained in the prone position at the Weir estate was unsuitable. In addition, there was an absence of leadership. This led to a failure to take appropriate control of the situation. It is questionable whether the relevant police guidelines or training regarding restraint and positional asphyxia were sufficient or were followed correctly. The restraint of Sean Rigg lasted approximately 8 minutes, whilst the handcuffing took approximately 30 seconds. Sean Rigg was in the prone position throughout the entire restraint. The agreed view of the jury is that Sean Rigg was struggling but not violently. The length of restraint in the prone position was therefore unnecessary. It is the majority view of the jury that this more than minimally contributed to Sean's death. The majority view of the jury is that at some point of the restraint, unnecessary body weight was placed on Sean Rigg. And I'm going to pause there just to observe that 2 of the words that you used in your statement that you read out earlier, that you put in inverted commas, unnecessary and I think unreasonable, these were words I think that have come from the narrative verdict of the jury. Is that right?
That's correct.
So when you were describing the restraint using that language, that was not your personal assessment. It was based on the verdict of the inquest jury.
Yes.
Let's continue. Up to the point of being apprehended by the police, the condition and behaviour of Sean Rigg was that he was physically well but mentally unwell. The majority view of the jury is that both Sean's physical and mental health deteriorated during the period of restraint. The majority view of the jury is that during the walk to the van, Sean Rigg was physically unwell due to oxygen deprivation which occurred during his restraint in the prone position. Sean Rigg was in a V-shaped position in the footwell of the cage in the police van. The majority view of the jury is that he was in this position during the whole time that he was in the cage of the police van, 1950 to 2003 hours. Sean Rigg's physical health continued to decline during the journey in the cage of the police van back to the police station. Sean Rigg's mental health was already and continued to be very poor. As Sean Rigg was brought into the cage at Brixton Police Station, he was extremely unwell and was not fully conscious. Sean Rigg was fully unconscious by 2011. It is reasonable to expect the police to recognise that there was cause for concern regarding Sean's mental and physical health. It was reasonable to expect the police to have undertaken an assessment of both Sean's physical and mental condition from the point of arrest. No assessment was done of Sean Rigg's condition at any time before he became unconscious. There was an absence of actions by the police, and this was inadequate. The police failed to identify that Sean Rigg was a vulnerable person at the point of arrest, and he was therefore taken back to the police station instead of an A&D department, despite information about him being readily available and accessible. The police failed to follow the Mental Health Project Team standard operating procedure. From 1953 to 2003, whilst Sean was inside the cage of the van, there was a lack of care by the police. Whilst in the cage of the police station from 2003 to 2013, there was an absence of appropriate care and urgency of response by the police, which more than minimally contributed to Sean Rigg's death. Both the action and decision of the police to stand Sean Rigg up was unacceptable and inappropriate. Leaving Sean Rigg in handcuffs was unnecessary and inappropriate. The views expressed by the police officers that Sean was violent and possibly not unwell deprived Sean of the appropriate care needed, and there was a failing to secure an ambulance as quickly as possible. Whilst Sean Rigg was in custody, the police failed to uphold his basic rights and omitted to deliver the appropriate care. Despite the efforts of the police to resuscitate Sean Rigg using CPR, and later the efforts of the London Ambulance Service and King's College Hospital, Sean Rigg had already died at 2024 at Brixton Police Station.
Yes, a complete hour before it was said that he died at the hospital. A whole hour.
So the findings of the inquest jury perhaps stand in marked contrast to the findings such as they were of the IPCC.
Yes, it was starking.
And I understand that, in fact, the day that the coroner's inquest gave its verdict, Dame Anne Owers, who was then chair of the IPCC, announced that she would commission an external review of the investigation to identify areas for improvement for the IPCC, and that became the Casale review of the IPCC investigation.
Yes.
And I'd like to turn to look at that now. Again, it's in your folder, Ms. Rigg, but we'll bring it up on the screen. It's COPFS 02526A. And I understand that this was published in May of 2013.
Yes.
And if we can look at what is page 1 of the report, but I think is page 8 on the PDF. Here we have a summary of the review's terms of reference, which were to examine the IPCC investigation in light of both the evidence given at the coroner's inquest and the verdict of the inquest, to consider whether any further investigation is required with a view to misconduct or criminal proceedings against any member of the police service, to identify any lessons to be learned or broader issues for both the IPCC and the overall system for investigating deaths following police contact, to take account of the Rigg family's concerns, and to take account of parallel reviews relating to policing, mental health, and deaths in custody. So as I understand it, this review was to look at the way that the IPCC went about their task and to consider whether any further investigation was required, and where the review identified the need for further investigation. They didn't carry out that investigation themselves. They didn't look at the evidence anew. They effectively remitted matters back to the IPCs. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. But could I also add that this was quite unique? This was the first of its kind, where the Independent Police Complaints Commission had actually commissioned a review into itself. So this was set a precedent.
let's look at the findings of the review. Again, it's a lengthy report, 110 pages or thereby, so we won't go through it page by page. But again, I'd like to perhaps highlight themes that might be of assistance to the chair. So the review identified a number of failings in the IPCC's approach and a number of areas that they were required to then go back and revisit and look at again. And the first of those was the failure to address race. And I wonder if we can bring up what is page 20, so I think it's 27 of the PDF. That's perfect, thank you. And as you said in your evidence, Ms. Rigg, the family, notwithstanding their reluctance to mention race in their dealings with the IPCC, had anticipated it would be considered, and indeed it was there in the terms of reference, or ethnicity was there in the terms of reference, but there was no consideration at all of race in the IPCC report.
Could I just add, though that it was in terms of reference, I don't recall exactly, but that would have been part of the families and our legal team's input that race should be within the terms of reference. I don't think they voluntarily put it there.
I see. So was there some sort of consultation process before the terms of reference were finalised?
I think so. I think so in the early days. Yeah.
And the family and their legal team would have had an input to that
Absolutely.
process. All right. If you can identify that the heading there, mental health issues, 2 paragraphs above that. The review considers that the IPCC should have addressed the issue of race as included in the terms of reference of the investigation. The lack of reference to race throughout the report is not a sign of non-discrimination, but rather an indication of malaise and or lack of confidence about how to address racial issues appropriately. So that was Dr. Casale's view in relation to the IPCC's failure to consider race. Moving on, I understand that the review also considered that the failure to call into question the arresting officer's position that they were unaware that Sean was suffering from a mental health crisis, given the clear indicators set out in the report, which the review considered were manifest and arguably not difficult to recognise. So there was a criticism.
It was blatantly obvious that Sean was suffering with mental health on that particular day. And also, he was known to the police for previously of suffering with mental health. You know, he was in the police record. You know, he was known to the police, and it was obvious by his bizarre behaviour that it was not normal behaviour by an ordinary member of the club, ordinary member of the public who was not suffering with mental health.
You say that Sean was known to the police and they knew of his mental ill health. Was it your understanding then that information would have been recorded on the police systems?
Yes,
that he
it was.
Mentally unwell.
Yes.
And so if a systems check had been carried out, then that information would have come to the attention of the police.
Yes.
Is that right? And am I right to understand that at the time of his arrest and restraint, Sean was carrying his passport?
Correct.
Which would have had his name and date of birth in it?
Yes, not only that, on the day there were a series of 999 calls being made by the hostel staff to take Sean to a place of safety where his name was given, that he was relapsing, he was being psychotic and hallucinating, and that, you know, they tried to find a bed at the mental health care team, the South London and Maudsley. There were no beds available, so the next step is for the police to arrest him under Section 136 and take him to a place of safety, which is a hospital. All of that information was given, and it was recorded in the first CAD record, the first 999 call, which was at 4 something to 5 p.m. Can't remember the exact time. 4 something to 5 that day.
So as well as the indicators of mental ill health that might have been apparent from Sean's behaviour, he was known to the police on police systems, carrying a passport, and the hostel had alerted the police using the 999 system to his deteriorating mental health and the need for him to be taken to a place of safety.
Correct. There was also 999 calls made to the police by members of the public who could also see that he was suffering with mental health. During the inquest, the original 999 call was made, and clearly that witness said, that he suffered with mental health. It was obvious, blatantly obvious to everybody, except the police.
And certainly the Casale report concluded that there were, and I'm quoting here, manifest and arguably not difficult to recognise indicators of the deterioration in Sean's mental health, all of which were in fact set out in the IPCC report, and they included the fact that he was out in public in a state of undress, he was naked from the waist up, he was performing martial arts moves, and throughout the entire time that he was in contact with the police, he didn't speak a word.
Well, that's what the police say. We don't know what he said or what he didn't say because we were not there. But he was obviously unwell. He was in and out of traffic. He was in the middle of the street doing karate moves, which was, so he was a danger to himself and a danger to the public. He was kicking out, doing karate moves because he was exercising, doing Wing Chun. That's what he did. That's how he kept his body fit. But he didn't actually make contact. He didn't hurt anybody. He was kicking out and then turning around and doing it again. So he was just doing martial arts movements in the street.
Let's look briefly at page 19 of the report. That will be page 26 of the PDF. At the very bottom of that page, please. The review considers that there were a number of concerns that could and should have been raised in the IPCC report, and the first of those is that the position adopted by the officers that they were not aware that Mr. Rigg might be suffering from mental health problems was open to question on the grounds of improbability, given the clear indications of mental illness enumerated in the report. So here the review was critical, effectively, of the IPCC's failure to question the officers' position that they simply didn't realise that Sean was in crisis, given the clear indicators that were set out in the report itself.
Well, had they checked the passport, because he was arrested for theft of his own passport, where the officers claimed it didn't look like Sean. It was Sean. It looked identical. I recall the passport being shown to the jury together with the autopsy photographs to prove that it did look like him. I was going to add something else, but I've lost my trail of thought. Could you repeat the question? Or was there a question?
I don't have the live transcript in front of me. Oh, there we are.
No. I don't think you asked me a question. You were commenting that there was something else I was going to say. I can't
Well,
recall.
I had taken you to the part of the report where the review were critical of the IPCC's failure. Has it come back?
I remember. But they didn't check the name of the passport. If they had checked and radioed in, they would have brought up, that this man suffered with mental health and had a history as well.
So we've looked at what Dr. Casale had to say about the failure to address race, about the failure to question the officers' position that they didn't realise that Sean was experiencing poor mental health. Let's look at the other criticisms that came out of the report. There was also a criticism of a failure on the part of the IPCC to examine in detail the restraint methods used and to robustly analyse the officer's justification for their use of restraint. And I wonder if we can perhaps look at page 85, so that will be 92 of the PDF. It's the second bottom paragraph, begins the IPCC. There we are. The IPCC investigation report considered the use of force, including the restraint of Mr. Rigg, to have been necessary and proportionate, and thus there was no basis for considering that the police officers contributed to his death. However, in light of the evidence that emerged at the inquest, the review considers that the duration of the restraint in the prone position appears to have been prolonged beyond the threshold of what could be regarded as necessary, proportionate, and reasonable. In turn, this may have an impact on the question of the police officer's contribution to the death of Mr. Rigg. So another criticism here for a lack of robustness in the analysis around the use of force. And if we might look briefly at the bottom of page 23, sorry, that will be PDF page 30.
Yes.
Sorry, thank you. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you. Sorry. The paragraph above the heading resources, the review emphasises how important it is for the IPCC to be independent and to be seen to be independent. The perception of independence is an important factor in public confidence. For the future, this should be borne in mind when choosing external experts. The review recommends that the IPCC ensure that competent expertise is available to IPCC investigations from a wider range of independent experts, including restraint experts. And we touched on this earlier, Ms. Rigg. I asked whether you knew whether or not the IPCC had instructed an expert on use of force, and you were unsure, but it would appear, I think, from this comment by Dr. Casale's review that there hadn't been an expert on restraint brought in to assist the IPCC. And there's comment elsewhere in Dr. Casale's report that the IPCC did not have an expert on mental health to assist them either. So more.
I find that extraordinary that I probably knew that at the time, but it's almost 16 years, and of course, that's extraordinary that they didn't look at what was blatantly obvious, mental health, and I think, yeah.
That they perhaps didn't look at what was blatantly obvious, but also didn't have the benefit of an expert opinion commenting on Sean's state of health at the time. Let's move on and look at another matter that concerned the review team. If we can look at page 14, which is page 21 of the PDF, please. And this concerned the officers potentially having the opportunity to talk to one another, the officers not being separated. Yeah. If we could scroll down, please. Perfect. It's the paragraph beginning of serious concern. Of serious concern is the fact that the 4 police officers were not kept separate during the night of 21-22 August. The IPCC investigation report makes no reference to this, and it only emerged at the coroner's inquest that the 4 officers were initially separate, but were then placed together for more than an hour with a member of the Metropolitan Police Service, I think, MPS?
Yes.
before a joint meeting in the early hours of the 22nd of August involving various parties. The review does not understand the reasons given for this, including that the IPCC team were only observers at the joint meeting, because the decision as to the mode of investigation was not made until later that morning. The review considers that, in the interests of an effective investigation, the arresting police officers should have been separated and instructed not to speak or otherwise communicate with each other about the events until the IPCC was able to take detailed initial statements from each. This should be standard practice in cases of deaths in police custody. Such a safeguard would not preclude any necessary support being provided to each officer individually by appropriate other people.
Yes.
Were you, as a family, aware that the officers had been placed together in a room for a period of time?
Yes.
When did you become aware?
Perhaps during the investigations by the IPCC. So we had a liaison officer that would update us periodically, monthly. So it might have come up in conversations where we were updated, and so I also think we were privy to disclosure of documents once the IPCC's report was finished in 2010. That's when we started to get the documents. I recall at one of the pre-inquest reviews, we were able to gain access to the independent police, into the IPCC's offices to look at the documents that they were holding. And we used the precedent of the case of the Ian Tomlinson case, where that first happened, where we could actually go into the offices and see what paperwork they had. So when my solicitors did do that, they had the IPCC had a file called unused material. All of that material was taken out, and some of the best evidence was there. And I think some of the initial gold meeting notes were there. And I can't remember when I first became aware of when they were all put in the room, but I knew well before the inquest that had happened. And I think what was said when we were arguing as a family as to why that happened, they said that somebody was in the room to make sure that they didn't speak, but they couldn't remember who that person was. And we never got to the bottom of that. But ironically, during the inquest, one of the officers had said, during cross-examination, that they had meetings on the night, so gold meetings, and the IPCC were there, and that their notes were being made, which we were unaware of. And so what happened is that particular investigator had to come and give evidence and produce those notes that were made at the time on the night. So that was information that had been hidden from us. But I think on those notes, if I remember correctly, it would be, there were transcripts of the inquest as well. So I think what happened was that they had recorded that there were injuries. I can't remember everything that was in that note, but the IPCC were there on the night of Sean's death, and so much things happened. It's just we were just really surprised that they were allowed to sit in the same room while somebody was making sure that they didn't speak, but yet they don't know who it was that was in the room with them.
Let's move on to another criticism that comes out of the Casale review, and it relates to police interviews or interviews of the police officers. I wonder if we can look at page 95, which is 102 of the PDF. And it's just underneath the heading, the IPCC interviewer's stance towards the police officers. The interviewers did not pursue failures on the part of the police with sufficient rigour, e.g. the police officers' failure to establish that the passport was Mr. Rigg's and their failure to recognise indicators of mental illness. Most of the interviewers appeared ready to accept the police officers' view of events without following up potential lines of questioning. Some of the IPCC interviewers appeared to have the same expectations about police performance as the police officers' own understanding of what might have been expected of them. Those expectations were generally low. In the opinion of the review, they do not always correspond to acceptable standards for police performance. So we see here a criticism of the rigour with which the interview process was carried out when the police witnesses were called to give statements.
Yes, I think I recall as well, during the time when they were interviewed under caution, which was 7-8 months later, that they had a Police Federation representative who was actually answering on behalf of the police officer during being interviewed, which was completely inappropriate. And I think it was something like, I think it was about the mental health issue and whether whether it was recognisable or if it was normal or something. And I recall the Federation representative had said, what's normal in Brixton? Or something like that. Later on, he was actually one of the arresting officers that the IPCC arrested. One of the 3 officers that was arrested. It was that same Federation officer that was there in the very beginning. I think he was there on the night as the Welfare Federation representative, and also during the inquest, and at the time when they were being interviewed as well. It was the same officer. Yeah. Jeffries, his name was.
And I don't have the reference at my fingertips, but I seem to recall that Dr. Casali took the view that that intervention by the Police Federation officer was inappropriate.
Yes.
And shouldn't have happened, and she was critical of that intervention.
Yeah. I'm not certain, but I wonder if he was the person that was in the room at the time when they were all sitting in their office. I cannot be certain, but I suspect maybe it was him. I don't know.
I want to turn now to an issue concerning the thoroughness of the...
Sorry?
An issue concerning the thoroughness of the IPCC investigation, because I understand that the IPCC recorded in their report that the custody sergeant had gone out to check on Sean when he was in the back of the van in the yard at the police station.
Yes.
And reported that he was sitting on a bench. He said he spoke to Sean, had eye contact with him, and satisfied himself that Sean was conscious and there was nothing that he needed to do with regard to his immediate care. So that's a lift from the IPCC report. I'll not put it up on screen so that we're not constantly jumping between documents. But let's look at what Dr. Casali had to say about that. And we'll find her comments on page 6 of the report, which is page 13 of the PDF. Just a little further down, please. Thank you, that's perfect. So there was, of course, CCTV at the police station. So this is underneath the heading Custody and Care at the Police Station, 2 paragraphs down.
Yes.
The IPCC investigation considered the evidence of the CCTV at Brixton Police Station, but was not able to devote the time to this exercise accorded by members of the Rigg family, who painstakingly viewed and reviewed the evidence over a period of months. The upshot of this intensive scrutiny of the CCTV footage was the discovery by the Rigg family that the custody sergeant did not visit Mr. Rigg while he was in the police van parked in the yard at Brixton Police Station.
Yes, it was my brother Wayne that first uncovered that.
Okay. This crucial finding emerged at the coroner's inquest. The IPCC had accepted Sergeant White, that's the custody sergeant, and PC Harritt's accounts that the sergeant had visited Mr. Rigg while he was waiting in the van. The review understands that the differing accounts provided by these police officers to the IPCC and to the coroner's inquest are the subject of a separate investigation. I wanted to ask you some questions about this. Are you concerned that the IPCC didn't devote sufficient time to the analysis of the footage, and that they failed to identify that the custody sergeant had not visited Sean as he had claimed?
I'm more than concerned.
Mm-hmm.
So at the very early stages of the investigation, before, just after Sean died, and before the first official meeting with the IPCC, which was in September 2008, the family had the family had viewed the footage at the offices of the IPCC with our solicitors, Hickman and Rose, and it was Anna Mazzola was our solicitor at that time, working with Daniel Makova, and we saw the CCTV within the custody suite, and this was just weeks after Sean's death, so there was no time for tampering or anything like that. So we knew that the CCTV showed everything. When years later, and they'd also disclosed CCTV footage to us after the 2010 report. So my brother Wayne and myself were going through the CCTV meticulously. There was also audio, but they'd be giving it to us in a state that was difficult to follow. It was desynchronized, and there was footage embedded in other footage, so it was difficult to follow, but that's all we had to work with. Eventually, weeks before the inquest, or a month or two before the inquest, we were given a compilation CCTV that was going to be used in the court. So the IPCC had sent it to an expert, which was an ex-police officer. We were arguing with the family. The family were concerned about that, what was the independence of sending it to an ex-police officer, but they did that anyway. When we received the footage that was going to be used at the inquest, the compilation CCTV, it was missing, or spliced, I like to use, 29 seconds from the footage, the original footage. 29 seconds is quite a long time when you look at it. And the footage that we were given was that the van had arrived into the station, and then suddenly Sean was in the caged area, and the holding cell collapsed. So 29 seconds was missing. The bit where Sergeant White did not go to the van, and the bit where we could not see that Sean was removed from the van and heavily assisted. He did walk, but it was a strange walk, and that was all missing. But we knew it existed, you see. So we had a pre-inquest review with the coroner, and insisting that we received the full footage, and he agreed. And so when that was received, my brother was one of the first ones to look at the footage, and that's when we uncovered that Sergeant White never left the custody suite. He went into the caged area, but if he'd just taken one more step, or just one step, we would never have known, because there was a wall and you couldn't see. There was cameras inside the yard where the van was parked. That camera went missing, or did not exist. We were told it didn't exist when we said it did exist, because we had seen it ourselves 2 days after Sean had died. it's kind of difficult to go back and forth, but we'd physically seen the camera outside in the yard, which would have captured what was happening to Sean in the van once he had arrived. And the IPCC first said that that camera didn't exist. And then when we said it did, they said, it's not been working for 3 months. And then we asked, well, how often do you maintain the CCTV at Brixton Police Station? And we, when was it last the last maintenance of it? And there was a report done, and they came back, and we were told that it had been maintained 9 days before Sean had died, where all the CCTV in Brixton Police Station was working. And then the IPCC came back and said to us that that must be wrong. That must have been a mistake. So basically, they denied the fact that CCTV was working on that night. There was also another camera within the caged area, if I remember rightly, that would have probably given a bird's eye view of what was happening in the cage with Sean. And it's those two cameras that we've never seen. So the footage that can be seen, that was shown at the inquest, is from a camera that was in the corridor looking into the cage. But we knew that there was footage. There's also another camera from the gate. So when the van arrived, you could see within the yard. So basically, what I'm trying to say is we were given a faulty, or what I would call tampered footage, missing 29 seconds, which proved that Sergeant White did not go to the van. And that was footage given to us by the IPCC. So they must have known. Somebody must have known. How could they miss 29 seconds missing? Because there's a clock. You know, there's a clock on the footage with the audio. There's a clock, and we studied it meticulously, my brother and I, and that's where we saw that 29 seconds was cut out.
And I understand that the sergeant in question was later prosecuted for perjury, having given evidence on oath at the inquest, although he was acquitted after
Eventually,
trial.
that was difficult to get him on the stand, but we did eventually get him on the stand after a few appeals, using the right to review, the right review scheme, I think it was called, and 3 officers had been arrested, in fact, as I mentioned earlier, because of the evidence that was given on oath that Sergeant White claimed that he did go to the van and gave detailed cross-examination to the coroner and to the jury, but that was a complete fantasy. He remembered a complete fantasy because it did not happen. So when we did get him to the stand, we had the first perjury trial in history for a death in custody. That was another precedent.
Another first.
Yes.
So we have looked this morning at the IPCC report and their findings. We've looked at the verdict handed down by the inquest jury, and we have dipped into some of the criticisms made by Dr. Casali in her review of the way that the IPCC went about its task. Now, I understand that's not, in fact, the end of the matter, that there have been developments since. And I think, in fact, the more recent developments are summarised in a statement that was issued by the IOPC, as they now are, in September of last year. So I think, for expediency, we'll perhaps bring that statement up and look at it very briefly. We normally break it around about 11:30, but I think we will perhaps have time to have a quick look at it. It's WIT 00018. No, that is not.
Well, why don't we just take the break now and then
Right.
you can get organised. So we'll have a 20-minute break now.
Thank you.
Ms. Thompson.
Thank you. Before the break, I was keen to take you to another document, but I had the wrong reference number, and so the wrong thing came up on the screen. I think we've got it now. It's WIT 00108.
Oh,
So-
yes, this one.
Yeah, so this is from the IOPC, which has replaced the IPCC, and it's headed up the circumstances of Sean Rigg's death and the history of the IPCC and IOPC involvement. And I thought this might be a useful document to take you to Ms. Rigg, because it sets out a summary of what has happened since the Casale review.
Yeah.
So I thought we could look at this probably in quite short compass, and then I'd like to move on to talk to you about your lived experience. But I'm conscious that the story didn't end with the Casale review, and I think it's important to give context to what happened beyond that report. So if we could perhaps scroll through this document. We see here some of the circumstances that we've already heard about and you've given evidence about today, so I think we can probably skip through. There is, if we pause here, there's reference to the inquest. You were right, it was 7 weeks, 60 witnesses, and the 1st of August was the date that the jury handed down their verdict. The following paragraph sets out that in light of the jury's conclusions, the IPCC commissioned an independent review, and that was, of course, Dr. Sylvia Casale's review, published in May 2013. Then there are a summary of some of the conclusions in the Casale review, and then beyond that, if we can go to the paragraph following the Casale review, and let's read from there on. Following the Casale review, the IPCC conducted a second investigation, which concluded in February 2016. And I'll pause there just to note that that is what we discussed earlier, that the Casale review didn't look at matters afresh, simply looked at the way the IPCC had gone about its task, and to the extent that it identified failings, those were brought to the attention of the IPCC, and the matter was effectively remitted back to the IPCC to look at again.
Yes, I think Sylvia went through all the evidence with her team and as to what came out in the inquest. But she did speak with, I know she spoke with us, the family. I don't know who else she spoke to do that investigation. But she had all of the evidence that had been put before the inquest. I don't know what else she had. I don't recall, but yeah.
So her review was never going to be the final chapter in the story. It was simply a vehicle to identify failings, so that they could be brought to the attention of the IPCC, who could go back and revisit the work they had done previously.
Correct.
And here we see a reference to the IPCC's second investigation in February 2016.
Yes.
The IPCC was of the view that 5 officers should face gross misconduct allegations. Each officer faced allegations relevant to their involvement. These included the failure to identify and treat Sean as a person with mental ill health, use of excessive restraint, and false evidence given to the IPCC and on oath at the inquest. And these are all failings that we discussed in your evidence before the break, that were drawn out in the Casale review.
Yes.
If we read on, in September 2016, the Crown Prosecution Service decided there was insufficient evidence for a successful prosecution against any officers in relation to the events surrounding Sean's death. In November 2016, a custody sergeant was acquitted of perjury charges arising out of his evidence to the inquest, and that was Sergeant White. And again, we spoke about him before the break, and about the critical role of the CCTV evidence and what was uncovered by the family rather than the IPCC.
Yes.
There were lengthy delays between March 2016 and March 2018, when the IOPC directed the MPS, the Metropolitan Police Service, to bring disciplinary proceedings.
Yeah, that was long and drawn out. We were in discussions with the IPCC and the Met. I remember DAC, I think her name was, Fiona Taylor was involved in that, And also with, after the inquest, there was a Rule 43 report, a prevention of future deaths, where the coroner had made recommendations as well. So alongside the Casale review, there was other things happening. So there was the coroner's Rule 43 report and the responses by the Metropolitan Police and the Lambeth Council and the mental health team. So, yeah.
So there was a lot going on.
Yes.
I've considered the Rule 43 report. I'm not going to bring it up on the screen because the focus was more around what had happened in the hostel and the background events rather than really the actions of the police. But we see here delays, and then in March of 2018, the IOPC directed the MPS to bring disciplinary proceedings. And Sean, of course, passed away in 2008, so we're looking at nearly 10 years later before there was a direction that disciplinary proceedings should be brought.
Yes, there was a difficulty as to the delay into which the police would agree to, the Metropolitan Police would agree to the misconduct hearing. So we were back and forth on that, and then eventually they were directed by the IPCC to do that. IOPC, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Almost 10 years later. And what was the impact on you and your family of that delay, that passage of time between Sean's death and disciplinary proceedings being instigated?
Yeah, it was unnecessary and painful and upsetting, and made you angry because the delays. You know, we knew what happened. We had the inquest findings. We'd had the Casale review findings. There was so much evidence to show that, there should be some disciplinary action, if not criminal. And it was just taking decades. So 10 years down the line, it was exhausting. And but at least we were still there, and it didn't finish, back in 2012. So the pursuance from the family, to just at every juncture was also tiring, but it meant that, 10 years later it hadn't gone away. And now there was the opportunity for it to be looked at again. 10.5 years later, the officers claimed that they couldn't remember what happened 10 years before. So suddenly, in my view, they all suffered with memory loss, even though there was footage to remind them of what actually happened on the night. And so they'd made an application on the basis that it was the length of the case, 10.5 years later, and that it was a delay and it was traumatic for them, and they thought it would be unfair for the gross misconduct hearing to go ahead. And as an interested party, I was able to put my input into that on the families on behalf of the family. And I remember it was my birthday, the 1st of February 2019. It was going to go ahead, finally, almost 11 years later.
Let's return to this document. Some of what you said, I think, we'll see echoed in the next paragraph. Following a 6-week hearing which concluded on the 1st of March 2019, over 10.5 years after Sean's death, a police misconduct panel determined that none of the gross misconduct charges were proven against the 5 police officers. The hearing reached this conclusion having rejected submissions that the charges should be dismissed due to delay.
Yes.
So the officers who were subject to the disciplinary proceedings had put forward an argument that the proceedings shouldn't be allowed to take place because of the impact of the delay. Is that right?
Yes.
And what impact did that...
But they were the ones that delayed it in the first instance, and the investigators, so it wasn't the family's fault, it was them. They were using, a beating stick that they caused in the first place with the delays, and then tried to say that they can't remember and it wouldn't be fair and it was traumatic. But what about the family? Mm-hmm. It was infuriating.
Mm-hmm. If you could cast your mind back to that period in time, what was the impact on the family of the fact that the officers were putting forward this argument that the disciplinary proceedings shouldn't go ahead because of the delay and perhaps also due to the trauma for them that you've mentioned? How did the family feel about that? What impact did it have?
Oh, the impact was, affected our well-being, anxiety, and having to relive it, post-traumatic stress. The fact that, we wasn't going to see any accountability. They were trying to escape accountability, and then so that there was no misconduct hearing. But all that would have happened was that they would have been sacked. Nobody was going to go to prison by this stage. Nobody was going to be held accountable. But we felt that there was sufficient evidence for there to be a misconduct hearing. But obviously this was a police tribunal, and it was out of the hands of the officers. So what was extraordinary is that we felt like we were being criminalised. So there was security that followed me everywhere I went, including to the ladies' toilet, right outside the cubicle.
Yes, I think you mentioned that in your statement.
Yeah. And what did they think I was going to do to them? We were in a police vehicle, police building, and I don't know, did they think I was going to pull a gun out or something? I have no idea, but I found it extraordinary. Yet the officers were as close as you are to me. I could touch their shoulders if I wanted to. And they could just go about their business. They were sitting in the same canteen where we were having lunch. It was extraordinary, but yet we were being treated like the criminals here. It was also a public hearing. I think that was something that we were campaigning for, because misconduct hearings were being held in secret, if I recall, in the past. And I found that extraordinary, so we wanted it to be a public hearing, which did happen. But there was nothing public really about it, because the press and the public were made to sit in a completely different building around the corner with a screen such as this. And so, the CCTV in its entirety would have been shown, was going to be shown, but it kept breaking down, and so the public couldn't actually follow properly the public hearing. I was actually in the room, so they'd allowed 3 chairs for the families to attend, but we were heavily secured with security. Even for me to watch the CCTV within that room, it meant that I'd had to get up and move so that I could see it, head on, because I was sitting like these gentlemen are here. I was sitting aside and I couldn't see the screen. So to go into the middle of the room, security followed me and was in my face whilst everybody's watching the CCTV. My brother's dying my brother dies on camera and everyone's watching it. And yet that security officer was in my face. I was absolutely furious. It was painful. I was angry. And, there's nothing public about it, I felt. Yeah, it was wrong. And that, because of that, after the misconduct hearing, I insisted with inquest and my legal team that I have consultations with the Metropolitan Police, which is what I did, which also included other governmental bodies. I can't remember exactly who they were, but someone from the Mayor's office, the Met, myself, and others. I could get that to you, but to consult with them as to the way that families are treated at any hearing, be it the inquest or if you're lucky to get a private prosecution by the state, if you're very lucky to get that, and certainly a disciplinary hearing, which is fairly rare as well, to get them into a disciplinary hearing, and yet the family are the ones that are treated like the criminals. It's totally, totally unacceptable. And that's why I was consulting with the Metropolitan Police into the way that they treat families and the way that they conduct public misconduct hearings in the police.
Thank you. Returning to this document, so you've described very clearly the impact on your family, not only of the delay and the submissions that were made on behalf of the officers with a view to halting the proceedings in their tracks, but also your experience of trying to participate in that process effectively. As we see from the text here at the conclusion of the evidence, the Police Conduct Mispanel dismissed the charges of gross misconduct, finding that they hadn't been proven, but subsequently 3 officers pursued a civil claim against the IOPC arising from the length of the investigation faced by them. The claim was settled on agreed terms earlier this year, that is 2023, but without notifying Sean Rigg's family of the claim or the settlement. It came to their notice via a public statement published by the Police Federation on the 15th of May of 2023, the facts of which, in the view of the IOPC and Marcia Rigg, clearly indicated that it related to the investigation into Sean's death, even though neither he nor the police officers were named. And it concludes by saying it is in this context that on the 15th anniversary of Sean's death, the 21st of August 2023, the Acting Director General of the IOPC, Tom Whiting, wrote to Marcia Rigg in the terms set out in the IOPC's apology. So you ultimately received an apology from the IOPC for their failure to tell you that this claim had been brought and that it had been settled by the IOPC.
Yes, but I must add that it wasn't willing.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I had to engage and see that. So what happened is I saw a Police Federation article on their website. I don't know if they tweeted it or something. I can't remember. Anyway, officers, three of the arresting officers received compensation because of the delay, almost 11 years, and the trauma that it impacted on their family and their private life, which was infuriating. The IPCC did not tell the family, so I just came across it by chance. You know, I became aware of the article, and when I read it, I knew that it was about Sean, and I immediately made it public on my Twitter page, alerting the Federation and the IPCC that I was aware of the secret, because this was a confidential agreement between the police officers and the IOPC, which was sanctioned by the Home Office, who wrote the check. And I wondered, you know, how many times has this happened before?
So what impact did this discovery have on you and your family?
What impact in this I can't describe. I was angry. I'm still angry now, as you can see. It's totally unfair. And obviously the police officers didn't want us to know about it. I mean, one of them became a priest in the Church of England. You know, these officers went public in the media. I remember Burks wearing his dog collar, going on ITV News, saying that he was traumatized, but also saying that he would do the same thing again. And I suspect that he's one of these officers that received the compensation. And other officers as well, arresting officers, had been to the newspapers. These are public documents. They claim that they were suffering with their mental health and that they one of them had turned to drink. I don't doubt that may have happened, but that also happened to us. as the family. But, you know, all our trauma and our grief had just gone unnoticed. We were nothing. And I am somebody. And I'm human as well. And so was Sean. And that's absolutely outrageous that police officers, after what they did, can be paid compensation by the IOPC. What's that all about? No, that's not right. No.
So far this morning, Ms. Rigg, we've looked at what happened on the night of Sean's death, and we have taken a tour through the various reports that followed by the IPCC, the inquest verdict, Dr. Casali's review. And what I would like to do now is to ask you about certain aspects of your lived experience as Sean's sister in the days, the weeks, the months and the years that have followed his death, that perhaps bear some similarity to experiences that Shekabayo's families have had in the years since he died. And I'm hoping that you might be able to help the chair to the inquiry by drawing on your experience and sharing your thoughts about what might have been done better, what might have made a difference, and looking to the future, what might be done differently. And I wonder if we can begin with the night that Sean died.
Yes.
So the evening of the 21st of August, 2008, and I wonder if we can pull up your statement, please, and turn to page 15.
One five. 15, did you say?
Page 15, please. There isn't a paragraph number, but there's a heading here, initial information given after Sean's death. So I'm just going to read through this paragraph and then ask you some questions about it.
Oh,
I'll wait till you find the reference. No, not at all. It's page 15.
thank you. Yeah.
So it's under the heading, initial information given after Sean's death.
Yes.
On the night of Sean's death, my life changed overnight. My family were contacted by police liaison officers on the telephone in the middle of the night at around 2:30 a.m. who wanted to come and speak with us face to face. It was my brother and sister as I was out of London that evening, so my sister telephoned me. When the two female liaison officers arrived, they told us that Sean had died in Brixton custody, but didn't have much information in terms of how he died, just that he became unwell and suddenly collapsed in Brixton Police Station. Can I just pause there to ask what had happened in the middle of the night? Had you made your way to your brother's house or your sister's house, or was it your brother and sister who met with the family liaison officers and then later relayed to you what had happened?
Yeah. So I was Sean's next of kin.
Mm-hmm.
And I understand that the police or the police went to my house to tell me that Sean had died. But I travelled to Birmingham that morning. I just woke up that morning and just felt I needed to go and visit my father's grave. We're actually from Birmingham, and so I just felt to do that. And I booked a ticket. This was all just in that morning. I booked a ticket, and I went by coach, and I went to Birmingham. I arrived at about 7 o'clock that evening, but I wasn't feeling too well, strangely. I was feeling quite unwell for the next few hours, and later on, that's during the time that Sean was actually dying. But that's another story. But basically, I was in Birmingham. So the police had contacted my sister by telephone. Now, Sean was only carrying his passport that day. He didn't carry his phone or his keys. So I think they must have went to the hostel to get my contact details. Now, I think my name was on the system because, like I said, Sean was known to the police. There were times where Sean had been relapsing over the years occasionally, and the police would be contacted, and he was taken to a place of safety. On this day they didn't do that, but so they should have had my contact details, my number. Anyway, they didn't, and I wasn't at the address. I think I'd previously moved just before that as well. I moved address, and it was Sean that actually helped me to move from that address. So it was just, I saw Sean about 2 or 3 weeks before he died, and he was well. And I've lost my trail of thought. Ask me the question.
That's all right. Take a moment. What
Yeah.
I was keen to understand was what had happened
Yeah.
overnight. You've explained that you had gone from London to Birmingham to visit your father's grave, and you were out of London on the night that Sean died. And so it was your sister who
Yes.
contacted you. And I was keen to understand whether... I wasn't aware that you'd been in Birmingham, and perhaps that isn't a short journey, but I was keen to understand whether you'd made it back to London and had
Yes.
received the news with your brother and sister, or whether what we see set out here,
Yeah.
that they were told that Sean had died in Brixton custody. They didn't have much information. He became unwell and collapsed.
Yeah.
Whether that information was shared with you in person, or whether that was shared with your siblings.
On the telephone,
and
right?
they
So
passed it on to you.
yeah, so my sister received a telephone call. They got hold of Sean's phone, I think, because my sister had happened to phone Sean as well that day evening at 8:23, because it was in my sister's phone. So I think they went to the hostel, they got Sean's phone, and they rang my sister. I'm not quite sure how they got it, but they rang my sister's number and not mine, and said that they needed to come and speak to her face to face because about Sean. And my sister, so they were waiting, she was waiting for them to come to her house, my sister's house, because I wasn't at the address that they knew. So my sister then rang me in the middle of the night. It was about after 2 a.m. She rang me. I was in bed, just gone to bed to sleep, and I got this phone call. And I found that strange because it was like 2:30 or so in the morning. So I answered it, and she said, "I've just got a phone call from the police saying that they need to come and talk about Sean. He's dead. I know he's dead. She just knew." So what I started to do, so I waited for her to call me back when they arrived, and she called my brother, Wayne, and my sister is Samantha. And my brother went to her house, and the police liaison officers went to my sister's house, face to face, and told them that Sean had died, suddenly collapsed, and became unwell and suddenly collapsed at Brixton police station. They didn't know anything else. These were police officers, not liaison officers, not the IPCC or anybody else. They were the ones. So no. So my sister was relaying it to me on the telephone, and then I didn't go to sleep. I was calling the rest of my family, telling them that Sean had died, and I returned to London first thing in the morning. I went to visit my dad's grave, which is why I went. And I had to put 2 roses and 2 cards, one for Sean and one for Dad. And what I felt was that my dad had Sean. There was a reason I woke up that morning and just wanted to go to my dad's grave. And I lied on the top of his grave and cried and cried and cried. And then I took the first train back to London and went straight to the hostel in Brixton where the rest of my family were. So we was asking questions from then. Yeah, that's what happened.
Let's go back to your statement. We'd got to the part where you said the 2 female liaison officers arrived. They told us Sean had died in Brixton custody, but didn't have much information in terms of how he died, just that he became unwell and suddenly collapsed in Brixton police station. We were not allowed to see or identify Sean's body. That was our first concern. When can we actually see him? Is it Sean? Is he really dead? To our surprise, we were told his body was sealed off in a body bag, that his body belonged to the state, and so therefore we couldn't see him. They showed and offered his cancelled passport as a way for us to identify him. We found that difficult to comprehend and understand because it did not prove that he was dead.
Could I just clarify that this was, when I say we, I'm saying the family, but it was to Samantha and Wayne, my brother and sister, that they went to the house to see.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I don't recall if they said if Sean was carrying his passport at the time of arrest. They then handed us a bunch of leaflets because they were asking so many questions, one of which was an inquest leaflet with a quote from Roger Sylvester's family saying along the lines of, if it wasn't for inquest, we don't know how we would have been able to get through the inquest process. From then on, we just didn't trust what the police were telling us. We couldn't access the body. They wanted us to sign a medical release form because the police wanted access to his medical records, and they were asking questions like, was he ill? Was he suffering from any illness, such as his heart or anything like that? We contacted Inquest by telephone and left a voicemail, which they picked up first thing in the morning at 9 a.m. and contacted us. So I wanted to ask you a few questions arising out of what you say in that statement.
Yes.
It goes without saying, I'm sure, that what you have described here is every family's worst nightmare, to receive news that their loved one has died and in traumatic circumstances. Is there anything that could have been done by the family liaison officers to make that news easier to bear for your family? Anything about the method of delivery, the information provided? Would anything have made that just a little easier to bear?
Yeah, well, like I said, I wasn't there at the time when they arrived, but my sister and my brother told me that, you know, they're blasé kind of thing. They didn't know why he died or how he died, and they had no information to say. Just came to say, oh, your brother's dead, and we'll drip feed you with more information. They were more concerned about finding about information about Sean. First of all, I realise now in hindsight they shouldn't have been there. It should have been the IPCC liaison officers. But of course, by that time, they had not deemed it as an investigation by the IPCC until early the next, later that morning rather, even though they'd had goal meetings. So the police liaison officers didn't know what happened to Sean, but yet they've come to tell us he's dead. And they wanted us to sign a medical release form immediately then, trying to get my brother and sister to do that. My brother said that he had recalled seeing, not long before that, on the news about the death of Frank Urubu, where he'd seen footage where he had been restrained in the street. And so that came to his mind, and he said, but people don't just drop dead in police custody. What happened? And that's when they said they'll drip feed us. And they handed it, because we were asking questions, my brother and sister were asking so many questions, they wanted to leave, but they were probably there for an hour or two, and they ended up writing some notes in a little red notebook for us, which we still have somewhere, because we wanted to know what the procedure was. They didn't tell us that there was going to be an autopsy, Home Office autopsy. They didn't tell us there was going to be an IPCC investigation. I don't recall any of that. They just wanted to know, was he sick? Did he have a bad heart or anything like that? Which is not nice. That's not nice. And we couldn't see him. The first thing that somebody wants is, if your loved one has died, you just want to go and see them, dead or alive, to hug them, to kiss them. That's the first part of the grieving process, but we weren't allowed to, because they said that you can't see him, he's sealed off in a body bag. His body belongs to the state, and we couldn't understand that. So it was right from the very outset, it was like, but what's this all about? We didn't know. So my sister, while they were sitting there, she's on the computer trying to, Google you know, find out what's going on, and my brother's speaking to them. You know, it just didn't make any sense, basically. And what was extraordinary was that we couldn't go and see him. How do we know he's dead? And you know what they did? They produced the passport that they said Sean had stolen. They produced a passport to say, you can identify him from this. That didn't make any sense. That doesn't mean he's dead. I don't know how they'd had his passport. Well, we know now, you know, because he was carrying it. And in fact, they gave us the passport back, not the police liaison officer. Shortly after that, the IPCC returned the passport to us. But then one morning, I just remember waking up saying, but hold on, that's just the main evidence. The passport. And so it became, 4 years later, we returned it. It became part of the exhibit, one of the exhibits, because they gave it back to us. It was extraordinary, really. You know, that's just some of the initial things that I can remember. So Sean was dead, and they didn't know how.
So looking back, do you think it might have helped your family if the liaison officers had been able to give more information, more factual information about what had happened to Sean, more procedural information about what to expect going forwards, an autopsy and things of that sort? Do you think that might have been helpful?
Absolutely. I don't think they even told us why he'd been arrested. No, they just said he dropped dead, he became unwell, he was dead in their custody, and we'll drip feed you with more information. Was he sick? You know, sign this medical release form, because they wanted access to his medical record, and to get out of there, get out of the house. And that's cold. You know, if you're a liaison officer, you should be liaising with the family. You should be caring. You should be familiar as what to death is, because everybody in this room has experienced a death of a loved one, of a family. It's a no-brainer.
And looking back, do you think it might have helped your family that night if there had been more compassion, more focus on the family, and perhaps less in the way of questions about Sean and his health?
Exactly, that's the word, compassion. There wasn't any. We were just left in limbo, and it, you know, there was just more questions and more questions. If he died in their hands, you know, so to speak, in their custody, why couldn't they tell us what had happened? Why was he arrested? Why is he dead? But, you know, that information was not forthcoming. It took months and years to find out actually what happened.
Looking back, do you think it would have helped your family if they'd been able to see Sean straight away that night, or perhaps the next morning? Would that have helped them to come to terms with the reality of his death and begin the process of grieving?
Yeah, well, yes. Well, we did get to see him on the Saturday, 2 days after his death. So, of course, it was in the middle of the night, and we was gathering the family on the telephone. You know, my other siblings, and you know, of course, we would have gone. You know, first thing in the morning to go and see Sean. Is he really dead? You know, it was a day that we was worried that might happen one day. Anyway, because you know he suffered with mental health for 20 years, and he relapsed, and sometimes Sean would actually go abroad, and most of the time he was well, but sometimes he would relapse. But we thought, well, maybe, and the mental health team didn't tell us he was abroad, things like that. And so we were concerned that one day we might get this phone call that he had died. And so we were just in investigative mode immediately with all these questions. And I think most families would ask the same thing. Anybody would, you know, well, where is he? When can we see him? And they were obstructing all of that. And so from the very outset, we were concerned, even though we'd had trust, you know, a fair amount of trust in the police. You know, we didn't know about deaths in custody, that police kill people. So You know, we wasn't on that radar. We just wanted to know what happened in Brixton Police Station.
And can I ask this lack of compassion, lack of information, greater interest in questioning the family about Sean, no opportunity in the immediate aftermath of his death to see his body. What impact did that have for the family in terms of their relationship with the IOPCC from that, the police and the IOPCC from that point onwards? You say in your statement, from then on we just didn't trust what the police were telling us.
No.
What was the impact? What damage was done by the way those initial conversations were managed?
What do you mean,
by the
damage?
liaison?
Damage to who?
To the relationship that you might otherwise have had with the authorities. What was the impact on that
Yeah,
relationship?
well, we didn't trust the police for a start off. You've got his passport. You didn't say he'd been arrested for stealing it. You just shown it to us as identification. The lack of compassion. So, you know, we didn't trust them anyway. They didn't tell us about the IPCC. It's just they handed a bunch of leaflets, and my sister saw this one and called inquest. It was about, you know, in the middle of the night, 3 o'clock or whatever time it was. They called back, and they were the ones, inquest were the ones that said, by the way, there's going to be an autopsy and there's going to be an IPCC investigation. We'd never heard of the IPCC. So that was the introduction of them, of the IPCC. And inquest had contacted the IPCC, who then called us. So the investigator was somebody called Christopher Patridge, so we met them on the telephone. And we wanted to stop the autopsy, halt it. It was bank holiday weekend, carnival weekend, and we wanted representation at the autopsy. This was the advice from inquest. We didn't know what to do. All we wanted to do was to see him, and we couldn't do that. So the next step was that we found out there was going to be an autopsy, but we hadn't identified him yet. So that was strange. And so then the IPCC said we couldn't see him. That so we'd stopped the autopsy in the morning, trying to get hold of somebody called Nat Carey, trying to find a pathologist that our solicitor, Hickman and Rose and Inquest, advised us to look for. We couldn't get hold of anybody, so the autopsy went ahead regardless. The Home Office autopsy went ahead regardless that afternoon. And then, so we were waiting to find out how he died. We thought we'd find out then. So this is Friday, the very next day, the 22nd of August, the very next day. And then we were on the telephone with the IPCC, who then said that they didn't know how he died. His death was unascertained. They told us there were like superficial injuries, none of which had caused his death. And so we were more puzzled, you know. In between that time, we'd go into the hostel, asking them questions, and we found out that there was 999 calls to the police, and that he'd left the hostel and was in the street, and that he had relapsed. So we found that all out by ourselves, not by the police or the IPCC. And then they just thought we'd probably be at home grieving. We were grieving, but we had friends around us that were taking notes. And we just wanted to know what the hell happened. Excuse my language. Then, so they couldn't tell us how he died. So then we wanted to see him anyway. We still hadn't seen him. And they said that you couldn't see him until like 6 days later. I was like, really? When does the mortuary close? Because it was bank holiday weekend. Anyway, that was all nonsense. We got to see him the Saturday morning. Mm-hmm. because we were talking to the IPCC in the night, late that night. And then we went to identify his body at Greenwich Mortuary, which was another devastating thing.
Would you mind if I were to take you to the paragraphs in your statement where you discuss that
Yes.
experience?
Yes.
Let's look firstly at paragraph 26. They wouldn't allow us to see Sean before the autopsy, which is what we wanted to do. Then they said his body was seized and belongs to the state. It was our brother, it was our mother's son, and we wanted to see him. I think any family, any human being, if their loved one dies in whatever circumstances, the first thing they want to do is see them. And that's what you've been telling us this morning, that it was very difficult not to be able to see Sean straight away, and it was difficult to accept that he was dead without having seen his body. Can we move to paragraph 21? The autopsy went ahead on Friday 22nd August, but we had not yet identified Sean. The IPCC lead investigator at the time, Christopher Patridge, didn't want us to see Sean until 6 days later, arguing that it was bank holiday weekend. Our argument was, when does a mortuary close? Because obviously people die every day. And again, that's what you've told us this morning. Reading on, after overnight discussions, the IPCC finally agreed and we were able to gain access to Sean's body the next morning, Saturday 23rd August 2008, at Greenwich Mortuary. Sean was seized behind a locked room. We were not able to touch or hug him, and we could only view him through the glass window once they pulled back the curtain. I became overwhelmed and suddenly fainted. My family helped me back to my feet, and I was brought some water. We were only able to see one side of Sean's face, which was the left side, and his body was sealed off in a body bag from the neck down. We have never seen his body to this day, and of course he'd already had the autopsy. We couldn't see any significant injuries to the left side of his face that was visible, but nor could we see the right side of his face at all. We asked for the room to be opened so that we could go inside and see the other side of his face. The IPCC family liaison officer was present, Richard Omotosho, together with Christopher Patridge, our first time meeting the IPCC, and somebody, I think her name was Geraldine, from the coroner's office. They were all very reluctant to unbolt and open the room. Their excuse was because of Sean's dignity, and we felt they just didn't want us to see his body. Eventually, because of our categoric insistence, they reluctantly agreed, unbolted, and removed the rod and opened the room. We all went inside, squeezing around Sean to the other side of the bed. There were injuries on the other side of Sean's face that we had not been told about by the IPCC, which was absolutely horrific for all my family. At some point at the mortuary, I can't remember if it was before or after we went inside the room, I was given a temporary death certificate as Sean's next of kin so that we could start making funeral arrangements.
Yes.
Okay. Sorry, can you bear with me just a moment, please? Sir, I'm advised that the live feed is not functioning, and I'm
Yes, I see that's coming up on the screen.
adjournment.
So we'll have to take a short adjournment to see if we can resolve that.